Hello, everyone. Professor Cornish here. Today, we're going to be exploring procedural justice and ethics. We're going to be examining utilitarianism, social justice, and social contract theories, as well as the crime control and due process perspectives, and examining, is it ethical to violate a suspect's constitutional rights? So let's go ahead and get started. Now, first, we're going to explore what procedural due process is. And this is adhering to the due process perspective. Now, due process, it's concerned with the maintenance of a citizen's rights and liberties. So those constitutional rights. Now, in regards to the criminal justice system, we're looking at the constitutional rights that pertain to criminal procedure. So the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Eighth, and 14th Amendments. Now, procedural justice and due process views the government's primary duty is to maintain human freedom and provide protection against undue government influence. Now, specifically pertaining to the criminal justice system, an individual that's accused of a crime, they are considered legally innocent until proven guilty. Now, the reason why we have that view is before the Enlightenment period, if you were accused of a crime, you were automatically assumed to be guilty. You had everything stacked against you. And you weren't allowed to give testimony for yourself. You weren't allowed to cross-examine the government's or the Crown's evidence against you. You weren't allowed to present evidence on your own. So it was pretty much you were shackled at your ankles, handcuffed in the back, chain tied around a cement block, and you were thrown into the deep end of the pool and expected to swim. Obviously, you can't. So that's why with our current system, an individual that is accused of a crime, they are presumed innocent. And the government has the burden, which for criminal trials, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove the guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, with our system, someone that's accused of a crime, they are given certain rights and protections guaranteed by our Constitution. You know, those constitutional amendments for criminal procedure. And they have to be tried according to specific procedures. And there's even rules that law enforcement has to abide by, the criminal court has to abide by, as well as corrections has to abide by. Now, the sources of these rights and protections, as well as the procedures, can be found in the United States Constitution, state constitutions, federal and state case law, federal and state evidentiary procedures, you know, how evidence is handled, statutes, regulations, policy and procedure, federal and state licensing boards, and professional organizational guidelines. Now, the procedural due process model, law enforcement has to treat citizens they encounter justly and fairly. You can't treat someone like complete garbage just because they committed a crime. Now, with the due process perspective, it is the duty of the court system and also law enforcement corrections as well to uphold the rights and protections guaranteed to the accused, ethical guidelines, and ensuring the courts have to ensure the other facets of the criminal justice system are not violating an individual's constitutional rights. So not only do the courts try someone that's accused of committing a crime, they also are the check on the other parts of the criminal justice system to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, to make sure they're not violating someone's constitutional rights. They also check the legislature as well, making sure that they're not passing statutes and acts that violate someone's constitutional rights. Now, due process rests the faith of maintaining an individual's constitutional rights in the court system. Law enforcement corrections, they're not supposed to violate somebody's constitutional rights, but the courts, especially being that ultimate check, they have to make sure the other facets are definitely not doing it. And if they are, they've got to check them. It's like a parent grounding a kid. You know, the kid messed up, did something they weren't supposed to, the parents got to ground them. They got to do some kind of punishment. That's what the court does. Now, the court, it maintains the integrity of the entire criminal justice system. So why can't we violate a suspect's constitutional rights? That's our ethical dilemma. And now that, you know, we know what due process is, let's actually look at ethical theories to really dive into, would it be ethical to violate a suspect's constitutional rights? So the first perspective we're going to be looking at is utilitarianism, which utilitarianism, the crime control perspective, falls under utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism, it's focused on really an act being ethical or not based on the end results. You know, the end justifies the means. And it's rooted in hedonism, which with hedonism, it states that we, being human beings, we are going to gravitate towards what gives us the greatest amount of pleasure, and we're going to avoid what gives us pain. Well, with utilitarianism, we're not focusing on the greatest amount of pleasure for the individual, we're focusing on the greatest amount of pleasure for society. So an act, it's determined to be ethical or not ethical based on, does it give the greatest amount of benefit, the greatest amount of pleasure to society? Now, the application of hedonism in utilitarianism is known as hedonistic calculus, which basically, as I stated previously, an act is considered ethical if it produces the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. So we're focusing on really the majority of society. We're not focusing on individuals or even small groups of individuals. Now, utilitarianism, it justifies whether an act is ethical or not on if it benefits the majority of people. Now, utilitarian justice is the application of utilitarianism into the criminal justice field. And it states that violating an individual's constitutional rights would be ethical if they were guilty. You know, they did commit a crime that harms society. So, hey, do what you got to do to get them removed from society, to get them found guilty and sentenced. Now, when we look at Bentham's hedonistic calculus, with Bentham, researcher, did a lot of research and applying of ethical theories to the criminal justice system, especially law. And really, he felt that if you commit a crime, you need to get the greatest amount of pain that's possible. As long as you're punished for a crime that hurts society, it doesn't matter if your rights were violated or not. So as you can see, utilitarianism, the crime control perspective would fall under that. Now, utilitarianism, when it comes to violating a suspect's constitutional rights, it's a double-edged sword. Either end is going to get you. It would view it as ethical because someone that is guilty, they're being removed from society and incapacitated. So they're being punished for the crime they committed that harms society, as well as if they're incarcerated, during their incarceration, they're not going to be able to commit additional crimes that are going to hurt society. So they harm society, they're getting their just desserts. It doesn't matter how we got them there. So if we violated their constitutional rights, that's okay. But utilitarianism would also view violating a suspect's constitutional rights as unethical because, now going back to procedural justice, if their constitutional rights are violated, let's say by law enforcement, law enforcement, they didn't get a warrant and they did a search, they planted evidence, whatever happened, the court, if they find out about it, which the defense attorney, if they realize law enforcement did something illegal, they've got to make sure they let the courts know. They're going to be filing motions to get the evidence tossed. The court has to bring that ultimate check once they realize that suspect's rights were violated by law enforcement. They have to act. So if, let's say, law enforcement did plant evidence or they did obtain, let's say, an illegal confession, the defense ends up filing a motion to exclude that evidence from trial. Judge is going to review everything and go, yep, law enforcement obtained that confession illegally. It's inadmissible. That's the exclusionary rule. And any evidence that law enforcement would have gotten from that confession, it's also going to be excluded too. It'll also not be able to be used at trial. That's the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. And if there isn't any evidence left when everything's said and done, the defense attorney is going to motion to get the case dismissed. Judge will review, and if the judge feels that there's nothing left, case is dismissed. Or if it ends up going further and it actually gets to a jury, the jury might end up acquitting that person. Even though the criminal offender's guilty, their case gets dismissed, they could get acquitted, or they could end up appealing their conviction. And if the appeals court decides, yes, law enforcement violated their constitutional rights, the trial court didn't do what they were supposed to do, they're either going to reverse the conviction or they're going to send the case back to be retried. So you're either going to have a criminal offender that's end up not going to be getting any punishment, or society is going to end up having to pay for a whole brand new trial. So you could potentially have that criminal offender who is guilty end up not receiving any punishment and being able to commit new crimes. So utilitarianism would view it ethical and not ethical. Now, next, we're going to look at social justice, which where utilitarianism focused on the benefit to society as a whole. Social justice looks at the little guy. So they're focusing on individuals, they're focusing on the minority of society. That, hey, it's fine and good that we're doing what benefits society as a whole, but we can't violate the rights of the minority of society or even the individual citizen to benefit society. Doing that is unethical. So under social justice, it views that the government and the criminal justice system, they cannot sacrifice the constitutional rights of any citizen, whether they're guilty of a crime or not, to benefit society. So it's stating that we have to make sure those constitutional rights are not violated. So social justice, the due process perspective would fall under social justice. Now, the reason why we have these rights, so many constitutional rights, when we are accused of committing a crime is, as I stated previously, before the Enlightenment period, we didn't have any rights. We were guilty and had to prove ourselves innocent. And we had no avenue to do that. So there were a lot of people that were wrongly convicted of a crime. And that is considered really the ultimate injustice of our criminal justice system, is if an innocent person is wrongly convicted, especially if they end up being put to death. So that's why we have the rules that we do, is to make sure we're not wrongly convicting somebody that's innocent. And hopefully, because the criminal justice system has all of these rules, all of these procedures, that hopefully if that person is truly innocent, it's going to be found out. Now, the last ethical theory we're going to dive into is social contract theory. Now, social contract theory, with this theory, it's stating that we as a society, we give up some of our rights for the benefit of society, such as if somebody committed a crime against us, we can't just go out and seek out revenge. That we're giving up some of our rights and telling the government, okay, we're letting you take care of this. We're going to have trust in you. Now, the reason why we have this is to avoid society falling into what's called a state of nature, basically chaos, like Lord of the Flies type things, Wild Wild West stuff, where you might have, bloody competitions, the strong preying upon the weak, people's rights getting violated. So we're like, okay, we're going to give up some of our rights. We as a society are going to agree to rules, and we're going to have what's called the designated assembly or designated person, the government. When it comes to laws, the criminal justice system, we're going to have them basically keep society in check, make sure things are going the way they're supposed to. Now, in our system, the legislature, they enact the laws and they develop sanctions for those laws. Law enforcement, they arrest individuals that commit a crime. They investigate crimes. They enforce the laws. The criminal court system, they try and convict individuals that have committed crimes. They ensure procedural due process. And again, they serve as the ultimate check for the rest of the criminal justice system. Corrections, whether it's institutional, jails, or in prisons, or community-based, probation, parole, diversion, pretrial services, etc., they're the punishment. They're the punishment for individuals that have breached their portion of the social contract, either by removing them from society or for supervising them in a manner where they're not going to be able to engage in harmful illicit acts. And they also ensure that if an individual is going to be returned back to society, that they're rehabilitated. So as a designated assembly, this is what the criminal justice system does. Now, granted, the legislative branch is not a part of the criminal justice system, but because they enact laws and develop sanctions for those laws, they do have an influence. So they're kind of in a fuzzy gray area. So would social contract theory view violating a suspect's rights as ethical? And the answer is no. If it's done by law enforcement, they're violating their part of the social contract by violating that suspect's constitutional rights, even if that person's guilty. Because law enforcement, as the designated assembly, they have rules that they have to follow. And with the criminal justice system, whether it's law enforcement, the criminal courts, or corrections, one of our parts as a designated assembly is we have to be role models to the rest of society. That this is how you have to act. This is how you follow the laws. This is how you do this. And so if, let's say, law enforcement, in the example for this presentation, if they violate a suspect's constitutional rights, they're not holding their end of the social contract because they're not following their own rules. They're violating the Constitution. They're violating laws and case law. And how can we expect the public to do what they're supposed to do and obey the laws if, hey, law enforcement's just doing whatever they got to do? They're just violating things right and left. So why do I have to follow the law when they're not? So that's why. So that's another reason why, we can't violate someone's constitutional rights, because we would be violating our portion of the social contract as the designated assembly. The criminal justice system, regardless of what facet it is, we have our own rules, our own procedures we have to follow. And if we're not following them, how can we expect your average citizen to do what they're supposed to? So thank you for watching this presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to contact me. And if there's ever anything that you would like me to do a presentation on, just let me know. Take care and stay safe.